to RNN Group's lunchtime webinars. This week we are talking about the endpoint assessment, and we have got James Godsall, our Director of Employer Partnerships and Apprenticeships, here to myth bust and tell you all about endpoint assessments. I'm Lucy Barnwell. I'm the Director of Marketing for the group, and I'm going to hand over to James, who is the fount of all knowledge with regard to the endpoint assessment and apprenticeships. So please, if you do have any questions throughout the chat, throughout the webinar, do pop them in the Q&A or the chat, and I will endeavour to ask James those questions throughout if necessary, or leave them to the end depending on the relevancy of slides and the information that's going to be given to you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the fount of knowledge, James Godsall, regarding endpoint assessments. And I'm very excited because I'm going to get to learn something today too. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, welcome everybody. So we're going to talk about endpoint assessment. We're looking at this specifically from an employer's perspective, but if you are a learner or you are thinking about taking on an apprentice, hopefully that is information will be relevant as well. I'm going to start off with my slides. We're going to jump out of the slides at a couple of points just so that I can try and illustrate for you a little bit more about the specifics of the apprenticeship. So we're going to go very top level and talk about endpoint assessment very generally. And then at specific times, we're going to zoom right into an individual apprenticeship, just so that I can try and highlight for you exactly what we mean when we talk about a practical assessment or an interview, so that you've got it for your information. A little bit about us. We're a college group. We're made up of 3 individual colleges and a university centre. We train around about 1,200 apprentices a year, and around about between sort of 300 and 400 of those will achieve in year, and another 300 or 400 will join us. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. So we've got a really good track record of getting learners to endpoint assessment, getting learners through Gateway and achieving learners. But we have also got a range of other offers available for adults, for those of you that are leaving full-time education, those of you wishing to retrain, and coming in the next academic year, we've got our HTQs, which I know Lucy will, if we haven't already done a webinar, we'll have a webinar on. So again, a real exciting thing for the South Yorkshire and North Nottinghamshire region. I'm going to make an assumption that you already know mostly about apprenticeships, but I'll cover it in general anyway. An apprenticeship is essentially a job with training. It's a government registered programme. All providers of apprenticeships are subject to Her Majesty's inspection through Ofsted, and will receive a grade on that. And all apprentices will undertake an endpoint assessment. At the bottom right hand of the screen, you can see exactly what we mean. As training providers, we tend to talk in terms that maybe you don't always understand. So you've got your old money in there, as well as what we would call them level 2, level 4, level 7, what exactly that means to you. But essentially, we as a provider operate from level 2 right the way through to level 6. This coming September, for the first time, we'll be delivering a level 7 apprenticeship. So again, we've got that breadth of experience from your entry-level apprenticeships right the way through to your degree level. Alongside that, we also work with a number of South Yorkshire training providers and other high-level institutions like universities, so that we use and share our information and make sure that the offer is as good as it can be. I think the days of colleges competing against each other are coming to an end, and it's a lot more around collaboration and sharing best practice. And with the new Institute for Technologies that have been awarded in South Yorkshire, you should actually see a lot more sharing of facilities as well, which is very exciting for the people of South Yorkshire. So what is an endpoint assessment? Essentially, the endpoint assessment is the end of your apprenticeship. It's the point where the employer, the learner, and the training provider say you are ready for going out into industry at whatever level that is. Now, for some people, it might be that you do a level 2 apprenticeship and you never darken our doors again. For others, it may be you're wanting to finish your level 2 so that you can progress onto the level 3, but it marks a point in your career where you are essentially being signed off as occupationally competent at whatever level and whatever standard you're undertaking. The endpoint assessments were created in collaboration with employers, and they're and also endpoint assessment organizations. So you might hear me talking about EPAOs. That is what we're referring to. And essentially, the endpoint assessment organization is the company that comes in to assess the apprentice at the end of their program. The easiest way to describe it is when you do your driving lessons, you do your test and all your training with an instructor. After a period of time, that instructor will say that you're ready for your test. They'll drive you to the test centre, and somebody you've never met before will get in the car and for 90 minutes make an assessment on whether or not you are safe to drive on this country's roads. An endpoint assessment is very similar. We do all of the training, or your training provider does all the training for you. Once everyone's ready and thinks you're confident for an endpoint assessment, they will invite that test centre to come in, and they will, through a series of different assessments, make sure that you are ready to go out into industry. And that's really important, because for some areas, we're saying that this person is now competent to change a gas boiler, or they are competent to use a multi-million-pound CNC or milling machine. So it is absolutely crucial that once we get to that endpoint assessment, we're all confident that the skills, knowledge, and behaviours have been met. Alongside completing your endpoint assessment, you may also have some mandatory qualifications to cover off, and I'll go through those on the next slide. So before you go through your endpoint assessment, you will go through what's called a gateway. The gateway is essentially the point where we all agree that the apprentice is ready for endpoint assessment. If there's any mandatory qualifications, like I mentioned earlier, they will have to have been achieved before you can go through your endpoint assessment. Other areas, so for example, one of our engineering qualifications, there is no mandatory qualification, but we include one because we know that that's going to help that apprentice to be more employable in the future and give them a good, well-rounded breadth of experience. We could not deliver that and they could still get to their apprenticeship gateway, but that would be down to you and your training provider. The other side of it is maths and English. So for certain apprentices, there is an expectation that they will complete maths and English, normally at a GCSE grade C or 4, but equally it might be slightly lower than that if the apprentice is studying at level 2 or has a recognised SEND need. So the training provider has got the responsibility for making sure that those skills, knowledge and behaviours have been demonstrated. Normally that will be in an e-portfolio. We use OneFile. There are lots of other ones out there. And the employer will also sign that off. My advice to employers is to make sure you are fully confident that that apprentice has demonstrated all of those skills, knowledge and behaviours. The training provider pays for the first endpoint assessment out of the funding they receive. The second resit and onwards, there is potentially an expectation the employer pays for it, and we are talking several £1,000s for some of these endpoint assessments. So it's really important that, and certainly the way we approach it is a once and well. We want it done once and we want it done well. So you as an employer have a voice in that. So when you get to your gateway discussion, you make sure you're happy that they have demonstrated all of the skills, knowledge and behaviours and they're confident to pass. The training provider will also speak to the EPAO, coordinate number of dates, and they'll make sure all of the relevant revision material is done. When it comes to coordinating dates, some of these assessments are multi-day assessments. So the bricklaying one, as an example, is a 2-day practical assessment, normally done at the college. You have to factor in that that apprentice will not be with you for those 2 days. So again, if you know that you've got a lot of work coming up or there's a specific time that's not going to be convenient, you need to make sure the training provider knows that when they're linking in with the endpoint assessment organisation. And then also make sure that the training provider you're working with is got some good revision materials available. At RNN, we do an apprenticeship boot camp. The boot camps are normally a couple of days up to a week. And in there, we'll be covering off all of the different elements of the apprenticeship. We'll be talking them through in detail exactly what to expect, and we'll be doing some mock endpoint assessments. We normally do that before Gateway, so we're all really confident that the learner's ready. If they fail their mock endpoint assessment, we've not lost anything. We can just make sure we apply the appropriate training in the area they're weak at and then book them in for the future. So the specifics, what exactly will an endpoint assessment entail? Normally, it will contain one of the following: a practical assessment. In fact, nearly all of them will involve some form of practical assessment, an apprenticeship interview, and in place of that interview, there may be a presentation on a project, written or multiple choice tests. So for some, that is a business improvement project. Others, it's a 50 question multiple choice online assessment, a presentation, and you can find all of that information on the Institute for Apprenticeships website. Go to the apprenticeship that you're potentially interested in or already studying, and you'll find an endpoint assessment link. I'm going to go on to the specifics of those different bits I spoke about. So as I do that, I'm going to jump onto the apprenticeship website so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And at the end of that assessment, they will get either a pass, a merit, or a distinction. Some don't have pass, merit, and distinction, but the vast majority of apprenticeships will have a pass, a merit, or a distinction. So it gives you an indication, if you're looking to take on an apprentice in the future, of how well they did in their particular discipline. If they got a distinction, which is what we aim all of our students for, you know that they have absolutely hit above the criteria expected. A merit would be met the criteria well, and pass would be met the criteria, but perhaps didn't blow any doors off. So it gives you an example there of exactly what is expected and the different levels. So the practical assessment. Practical assessment will normally be accompanied with questions. So as the apprentice is going through a practical assessment, the endpoint assessor will be observing them, but they'll often ask questions about why they did something. The idea of that is to make sure that they are doing it for the right reasons, that they've thought about things like health and safety, and to round out the practical observation that they're doing. So as an example, if they are machining a part for an engineering company, for example, they might say, why are you doing that with regards to reading the safe systems of work? And the apprentice will reply, because I've read the risk assessment and I know that this is an essential part of using this equipment. Tick. If they just see the observation, there could be a number of different reasons for why an apprentice did something. The assessment environment must closely relate to the apprentice's natural working environment. So normally they'll try and do that in the workplace where that's not practical. So those multi-day assessments that I mentioned, it's not practical that a company can shut down part of its business for 2 days. It will be done at college. But the endpoint assessment organisation will meet with the training provider to make sure that that facility meets their expectations, that it is practically linked and that it's as close to a working environment as you can get. The idea is it gives the apprentice the opportunity to meet the KSBs within the so that's skills, knowledge and behaviours in the apprenticeship standard. And they may take place over a number of days and they may have some questions to check on reasoning skills. I'm just going to jump off the assessment at this point to show you the bricklayer standard, because it's a good example of what a practical assessment will look like. So this is the Institute for Apprenticeships website. If you come down to the practical assessment, it will talk to you a little bit about why it's done, what they expect to see, what the delivery will look like. The practical assessment and questions, the fact that that takes 12 hours, so that's 2 days of assessment, which is a lot. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want someone watching me for 12 hours and asking me questions for essentially 2 working days. It's a lot of pressure for a learner, but I'll go through a little bit at the end about what you as an employer can do to help them to overcome that. But then specifically, they'll talk about what they expect to see. So rather than just saying, I'm going to come out and do a practical observation on you, Mr. Bricklayer, you would say, I'm coming out to see you and I want to see a minimum opening size of 450 mils in length and 450 mils in height in preformed cavity closures. I want to see partial fill installation. I want to see fire stopping, etc., etc. Now, we would do this particular assessment at college, but there are other ones, specifically in engineering, where they would want to come and see you doing this in the workplace. So when it comes to setting that endpoint assessment task, you can look through this, see what the practical tasks are going to be, and then have an idea from your work schedule of exactly when a good time will be. Because if the assessor comes in and doesn't see all of this, they'll either have to get it from another source, i.e. an interview, or it's a straight fail. So it's really important that you share with your endpoint assessment organisation exactly what you can facilitate. And then the endpoint assessor might say, okay, you can do 8 out of the 9 on there. That's good. We'll go ahead. Or you can only do 3. We're going to need to do it at college. So again, it's that conversation you have with your training provider to make sure that they're aware. Okay, so jump back in. Next one is the interview. This is the bit that most of our apprentices struggle with the most, because they can be up to 2 hours. Again, if I was to ask you as experienced staff, how confident you would feel with a random person you've never met before coming in and interviewing you for 2 hours about your job role, you'd probably feel a little bit nervous. Oftentimes here we're talking about young people. It is a very nerve-wracking part of their endpoint assessment. But they're not in there alone. They can go in with the employer, although the employer isn't allowed for the most part to say anything, but they can go in for moral support. But most importantly, they can go in there with their portfolio that they've created over the life of their apprenticeship. So in there, they can look for specific examples. And what we normally ask apprentices to do is to create a showcase portfolio. So that what we're doing is we're taking the best 4 or 5 pieces of evidence through observations, through professional discussions, through job write-ups, and we want to highlight those so that when, for example, an endpoint assessment organization says, give me an example of how you've worked with other team members, you can just pull up the example you've got in your showcase portfolio. You've got all the information there, and you can read the answers off there if you need to. The idea is you can demonstrate a deeper level of competence and understanding than is required in the standard. The supporting documentation is provided to the EPAO ahead of time, so you'll provide them with your showcase portfolio so that they know exactly what is in there. And again, it's not about catching people out. It's not about asking difficult questions. It's not clawed from the apprentice. It's very much around questions related to their apprenticeship standard and them demonstrating the answers. We'll do plenty of mock assessments. If you're working with another provider, I would make sure that you can be comfortable that they are doing those mock assessments, because it's the bit that apprentices can struggle with. And I think the second bit I've got, which is for the business administrator. So this is the assessment plan for the business administrator. And if I come down to the knowledge test on there, you've got the 50 questions. I'm jumping ahead a bit, but you'll see that on there. The portfolio-based discussion. So for this particular one, it's 30 to 45 minutes, so nothing too onerous. And they'll go through on there exactly what they expect to see. So they want to see that you understand the portfolio and you're validating your competence through use of the portfolio. You can demonstrate self-reflection, and then they'll make a judgment call based on your explanations. It even gives you specifics of exactly what they expect that portfolio to look like. So a minimum of 8 to 12 pages, at least one of the minimum knowledge, skills and behaviours outlined in there. This is more for your training provider to be aware of, because this is what they need to produce. But you as an employer want to be comfortable as well, that what you're putting in front of the endpoint assessor is accurate. Because if they get to the portfolio and it doesn't meet these requirements, they will reject that learner and it will be a fail. So going back to the interview, and then the final bit is the multiple choice or online exam. There'll be a bank of questions. They've normally got thousands of different questions on a particular discipline. They will vary, but they can be up to 50 questions. You saw there for the business administrator, it's 50 multiple choice questions, and they normally have 4 potential answers. So I'm sure lots of us have done online training at some point. It's very similar. You have 2 kind of wildly wrong answers, one that's sort of the right answer and one that's very similar to the right answer. The percentage that you have to answer correctly varies, but normally we're looking for 60% plus, and we normally do those at college because they have to be done in a controlled environment, as you would for all exams. So essentially what will happen is, and you can ask for them to be paper-based, by the way. So for some of our candidates, they feel more comfortable with a paper-based exam. You can request that from the endpoint assessment organisation. The questions will be provided to the college to then administer in a strict environment. Practice questions can be provided, but of course, when we're choosing from a bank of questions, there is a chance that those questions will match the questions that are going to get asked. So normally we produce our own questions that are similar but not exactly the same, because what we don't want is questions to come up in the exam that we've already given to a learner, because that's malpractice. So essentially we are looking for fidelity within the assessments themselves. And again, the assessments themselves will be done online for the most part, but can be done paper-based. So that's a whistle-stop tour of all the different elements of your endpoint assessment. I'm going to go through now a little bit about what you as an employer can do to help your apprentice when they come to their endpoint assessment. I mentioned earlier about how long some of these assessments are and how nervous you might feel as an employer to have to go through some of those assessments. So the first thing we can start doing is to try and bring that apprentice back down. The best way we can do that is just to ask them questions while you're going throughout your kind of day-to-day duties. They'll be getting regular mentoring, I'm sure, from you as an organisation. Make sure those mentoring sessions are asking them to answer questions relating to their apprenticeship. So why did you do that? So what did you learn from that? So I've shown you this. Now you tell me exactly what I've just told you, so you can see that they are showing their knowledge. It's important that you read those endpoint assessment tasks so that you know exactly what's going to be expected of them. The training provider should take the lion's share of the preparation for endpoint assessment, but equally, you as an employer are going to get asked questions as well. So it's important that you understand exactly what the expectations are. Of course, you're not doing that alone. It's important that you speak to your training provider. He's asked this question, she's asked this question. What do you think I should say? Because we are experts on those endpoint assessments. Give them time to revise. Sometimes when you go through Gateway, it can feel like we're finished. They're done. I can get them onto tasks that are really important and they'll just do their endpoint assessment when they've got time. It is important that you allow them time to revise. You allow them time to come into college, to do their boot camps, to do their mock endpoint assessments, because it's going to help build their confidence. Ask questions related to their apprenticeship and give them feedback. So if you've read through that endpoint assessment plan and you know what they're expected to cover, you can maybe start to ask them questions related to that. And then give them practical tasks related to their endpoint assessment. So I covered on there about the bricklaying one. You may decide actually cavity walling is not something we do very regularly, but it's definitely going to come up on their endpoint assessment. So how do we get there? How do we get them that confidence? If they're not doing it every day, it's something they're going to feel very nervous about when they've got to show a complete stranger a practical task. So working with your training provider, it's important that you say joinery, for example. A lot of our joiners don't do truss roofing, which is the kind of triangle bit on your roof. So we have employers that we can place them with to get that experience. We do master classes for it, but you've got to release them for that time, because otherwise they're going to ask them to do a truss roof. They're going to have done it maybe a year ago at college as part of their day release and not have done it since, and they're going to feel really unsure. So working with the training provider to give them that time is really important. And obviously assigning them a mentor, that is the most important thing you can do, is make sure that that apprentice has got someone they can speak to, who ideally is an industry expert in what it is that they're being trained in, who they can speak to with practical questions and any queries. We do a complimentary training course for mentors. So if you're interested in that, please contact us. It's a couple of hours. It's an online webinar, but it talks you all the things you need to be an effective mentor for a young person or anybody, passing on your knowledge. Any more questions, any kind of further questions after the webinar, please feel free to contact us through those means, and we'll pause for any questions.
James, that was really, really helpful. I can't believe I haven't got any questions come through from any members who are listening at the moment, but I have to say a 2-hour interview for a young learner, that must be quite tough. Do they get some interview training and help and support with that?
So so it's not a mandatory part of the apprenticeship, but we certainly do. And a large part of the apprenticeship bootcamp will be preparing them for what that apprenticeship interview will look like. So we do ourselves, and I'm sure most providers do, but it would certainly be something I would want to be comfortable with before I put an apprentice with a training provider.
Absolutely. I mean, many of these learners may not have even had a interview, let alone a 2 hours. That's great to know. Really helpful to describe it like a driving test. I totally understand now how that works. So thank you for that. That's really helped me to learn about the endpoint assessment. So thanks. I haven't got any questions for you from anybody pre this meeting or this webinar. So it just remains for me to sort of close the webinar, this lunchtime webinar. You can obviously get in contact with James and the team with the emails. It's apprenticeshipinquiries@rnn.ac.uk. The next webinar we are holding is on the 4th of June. It's also to do with apprenticeship. So it's an induction to your apprentice. So any employer who is interested in getting a bit of an idea about the, how to look after your apprentice, how to induct them in, how to make them feel welcome, how to just make them feel like the apprentice there is the best thing they've ever done for them. That is the webinar for you. So that is the 4th of June at 1 o'clock. We do these lunchtime webinars because it allows you to eat your lunch, learn something at the same time whilst hidden behind a computer. So it's giving you the best of both worlds if you're that busy. Huge thanks, James, for giving this information. It's fantastic. If anyone did want to know about HTQs, if you go to our RNN group website, there is a webinars page, and actually we did have a previous webinar on higher technical qualifications, so you can go on there re-watch that higher technical qualification guide, which basically is myth busting again on high technical qualifications and what they all mean. So yeah, thanks to everyone for tuning in. I hope you found this unit useful. If you are interested about the induction for apprentices, that is on Tuesday the 4th of June at 1 o'clock. Thank you again for your time and have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye bye.